There's a moment almost everyone can picture, a mob surging through the streets of Paris, the towers of the Bastille rising against the summer sky, cannon smoke breaking chains, a fortress falling. July 14th, 1789. The day, we're told, the French Revolution began. But here's the strange thing. The men and women who stormed the Bastille that day weren't there to start a revolution. Most of them didn't even know one was happening. They came looking for something far more ordinary, gunpowder. And the prisoners they freed from that terrifying symbol of royal tyranny, there were 7 of them. 4 forgers, a nobleman locked up by his own family, and 2 men who were, by the standards of the time, considered insane. So if the great turning point of modern history wasn't quite what we imagine, if the fire was already burning long before anyone lit a match at the Bastille, then a much harder question opens up beneath it. When did the French Revolution actually begin, and why has the answer been hiding in plain sight for more than 200 years? To find it, we have to stop looking at 1789 as a beginning, because it wasn't. It was an ending. The moment a system that had been quietly collapsing for decades finally ran out of ways to hide it. Let me show you what I mean. Picture France in the middle of the 18th century. On the surface, it's the most powerful nation in Europe, the largest population, the grandest palace ever built, a culture so dominant that kings and aristocrats across the continent spoke French to prove they were civilized. If you had stood in the gardens of Versailles in 1750, the idea that this kingdom would tear itself apart within a generation would have seemed absurd. But underneath the gold leaf, something was already broken, and it wasn't the people, it was the math. France, it turns out, was a country that could not tax itself. That sounds impossible for the richest kingdom in Europe. But follow the logic, because this is where the real story starts. French society was legally divided into 3 groups, called estates. The first was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third was everyone else, which is to say, about 97% of the entire population. Peasants, workers, merchants, lawyers, the whole engine of the country. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. The 2 estates that held nearly all the wealth and land, the clergy and the nobility, were largely exempt from the kingdom's main taxes. The people who could most afford to pay, paid the least. And the people who could least afford it carried almost the entire weight of the state on their backs. This wasn't a bug, it was the design. And for a long time, the design held, because a system like that can survive as long as the bills stay small. The trouble was, the bills were about to become enormous. To understand why, we have to leave France entirely and follow the money across an ocean, because one of the deepest roots of the French Revolution isn't in France at all. It's in wars fought thousands of miles away. Across the 18th century, France threw itself into a series of vast, expensive conflicts with its great rival, Britain. The most damaging was the 7 Years' War, a global struggle that stretched from Europe to India to the forests of North America. France lost, badly. It surrendered enormous colonial territories and poured a fortune into a war that ended in humiliation. And then, remarkably, it did something even more expensive. When Britain's American colonies rose up in revolt, France saw a chance for revenge. It backed the American revolutionaries with money, weapons, ships, and troops. The gamble worked. Britain was defeated, and the United States was born. But sit with the irony of that for a moment, because it's one of the great hidden hinges of history. France helped fund a revolution abroad, built on ideas of liberty and the rejection of unjust taxation, and in doing so, pushed itself to the very edge of financial ruin. The soldiers who came home from America came home carrying more than muskets. They carried the memory of a people who had thrown off a king. Ideas, it turns out, don't stay politely on one side of an ocean. By the 1780s, the numbers had become a nightmare. A staggering share of everything the French government collected each year went to a single purpose, paying the interest on its debts. Not roads, not schools, not the army, just interest. The kingdom was doing what any drowning borrower does, taking new loans to pay old ones, at ever higher rates, because lenders could smell the danger. And this is the trap that would eventually break the monarchy. To fix the debt, France needed to raise more revenue. To raise revenue, It needed to tax the people who actually had money, the nobility and the clergy. But those were exactly the people with the power to refuse. Every time a royal minister proposed reform, a fairer tax, a modest contribution from the privileged orders, the same wall rose up to block it. The nobility resisted. The courts, which were themselves controlled by aristocrats, struck the reforms down. The privileged defended their privileges, as privileged people usually do, and the crown, for all its supposed absolute power, discovered it couldn't force them. Think about what that means. The King of France, the man Europe imagined as an all-powerful ruler, could not make his richest subjects pay their share. The system had a fatal design flaw written into its very foundation, and by now it was too late to quietly fix it. So the debt grew, the reforms failed, and a strange kind of paralysis set in at the top of French society. A government that knew exactly what it needed to do and found itself completely unable to do it. That's the long fuse. Decades of debt, structural unfairness, and elite resistance, all of it building pressure that had nowhere to go. But a long fuse still needs a spark, and in the late 1780s, nature itself seemed to conspire to provide one. Here's where the story leaves the palaces and the ledgers and comes down to something every single person in France could feel in their own stomach: bread. For most French people in the 18th century, bread wasn't a side dish, it was survival. A working family might spend half its income on bread alone. In hard times, that could climb to nearly everything they earned. Bread was the difference between getting through the winter and not. And in the years right before the Revolution, the price of bread began to climb toward the sky. The cause was a chain of disasters that no one at the time fully understood. In 1783, far away in Iceland, a volcano erupted and kept erupting for months, poisoning the air across Europe and throwing weather patterns into chaos. Then came a series of brutal seasons. A devastating hailstorm in the summer of 1788 flattened crops across huge stretches of the French countryside in a matter of hours. That was followed by one of the coldest winters in living memory, so harsh that rivers froze and the mills that ground grain into flour ground to a halt. The harvest failed, and when the harvest fails in a country that runs on bread, everything else begins to fail with it. Now watch how the pieces start colliding, because this is the moment the separate crises stop being separate. As bread prices exploded, ordinary families had to spend everything they had just to eat, which meant they stopped buying anything else. Clothes, tools, small luxuries, demand collapsed. And when people stop buying, workshops close and workers lose their jobs. So now you have a population that is simultaneously starving and unemployed, in the exact same moment that the government is bankrupt and desperately trying to squeeze more money out of them. Hunger on the bottom, debt at the top, and in between, a system with no mechanism left to relieve the pressure. Each problem was making every other problem worse, and there was no one with both the authority and the will to stop the spiral. This is the part textbooks tend to flatten into a single line. There was economic hardship, but feel what that actually meant. A mother watching the price of a loaf double while her husband's workshop shut its doors. A city filling with hungry, jobless people who had done everything right and still couldn't feed their children. A growing, dangerous suspicion that their suffering wasn't just bad luck, that someone, somewhere, was hoarding grain, protecting themselves, while the country starved. That suspicion mattered more than we often admit, because a hungry population that trusts its leaders will endure. A hungry population that believes it's being betrayed will not. And by 1788, trust was gone. So now we arrive at the true tipping point, the moment the old system finally admitted it could no longer save itself. Cornered by debt he could not escape and reforms he could not pass, the king made a decision that would prove to be the most fateful of his reign. He called a meeting of a body that had not met in over 170 years, the Estates General. Understand what a desperate act this was. The Estates General was an ancient assembly, gathering representatives from all three estates, clergy, nobility, and everyone else. It hadn't been summoned since 1614. For the monarchy to reach back that far into the past was an admission, whether the king intended it or not, that the ordinary machinery of government had completely broken down. He was, in effect, asking the nation for help because he had run out of options. And in that single decision, he did something no royal minister had managed to do in decades. He gave the French people a reason to hope that things could change, and a stage on which to demand it. As representatives were chosen across the country in early 1789, something extraordinary happened. Communities were invited to write down their grievances, their complaints, their hopes for reform, in documents that were gathered from every corner of France. Millions of people, for the first time, were formally asked what was wrong with their country and what they wanted fixed. Imagine the effect of that. A nation that had suffered in silence was suddenly, officially, invited to speak. You cannot ask a desperate, hungry, hopeful people what they want and then simply hand them nothing. But that is very nearly what happened next. When the Estates General finally gathered at Versailles in the spring of 1789, it collided almost immediately with the same rotten flaw at the heart of everything. The question was deceptively simple. How would they vote? Under the old rules, each of the three estates voted as a single block, which meant the clergy and the nobility could always outvote the third estate 2-1, no matter that the third estate represented almost the entire nation. The representatives of the common people looked at that arrangement and refused. They had come to fix a broken country, and they were being told, once again, that the privileged few would overrule the many. The deadlock that followed was not really about voting procedure. It was about whether France would remain a country where the rules were written to protect the powerful, or become something else. And when the Third Estate found itself locked out of its meeting hall one June morning, its members did not go home. They gathered instead in a nearby indoor tennis court, and there they swore a solemn oath not to disband until France had a new constitution. In that borrowed room, ordinary representatives had just declared that their authority came not from the king, but from the people they represented. It was, in every meaningful sense, the beginning of a new idea of what a nation could be. Which brings us, at last, back to where we started, to the Bastille. By July of 1789, Paris was a tinderbox. The city was crowded with the hungry and the unemployed. Rumors flew that the king was gathering troops to crush the new assembly by force. Fear and hope had braided together into something combustible. And when the people of Paris went searching for weapons to defend themselves, their path led to that old fortress and the gunpowder stored inside. The Bastille fell, not because it was the start of the revolution, but because everything else already had. The debt, the unfair taxes, the failed reforms, the volcano, the frozen rivers, the doubled price of bread, the shuttered workshops, the broken trust, the desperate gamble of the Estates General, the oath in the tennis court, all of it had been building for decades, tightening like a spring. The storming of the Bastille wasn't the first domino. It was the sound the whole line made as it finally came down. So when did the French Revolution really begin? The honest answer is that it doesn't have a single birthday. And that's not a disappointment. It's the real lesson, the one worth carrying out of this story. It began in a tax system designed to spare the rich. It began on battlefields across the ocean, in wars France couldn't afford. It began under an Icelandic volcano and in a failed harvest, and in the doubling price of a loaf of bread. It began the moment a proud kingdom discovered that its king could command armies but could not command his own nobles to pay their share. History rarely turns on a single day, however dramatic that day appears in a painting. It turns on the slow accumulation of pressures we don't notice until they break. The people who lived through 1789 didn't feel history beginning. They felt hunger and fear and a fragile, stubborn hope that things could finally be different. The revolution was already alive in all of that, long before anyone saw a fortress fall, and maybe that's the most unsettling thought of all. The next great turning point in history is almost certainly building right now, quietly, in pressures we've decided not to look at too closely. We just won't recognize it, until something falls, and everyone rushes to call that the beginning. If you found yourself rethinking something you thought you already understood, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe and stick around, because the hidden forces that shape history are always stranger and closer to home than the version we were taught. There's another story waiting on your screen right now, and it starts the same way this one did, with everything you thought you knew.